Story 1. The Midnight Shoveler. I had recently relocated to a house in an unfamiliar neighborhood. While I'd scouted the area and visited a few times before closing the deal, I didn't truly know the place. During my initial walks, the street seemed remarkably peaceful, almost too quiet. People rarely lingered outside, and everyone appeared to keep their distance. Even on the afternoon I moved in, with a massive truck parked out front, and me constantly hauling boxes inside, not a single soul stepped out to say hello. Being a private person myself, I didn't mind the isolation, but I couldn't help but notice that every neighbor seemed to share that same coldness. It made it impossible to get a read on the people living around me. Everything changed on my second night. I hadn't started my new job yet, so my days were consumed by the stress of unpacking. I stayed indoors mostly to avoid the snow, driven by a frantic need to clear the mountain of boxes. Exhausted, I crashed around 8:00 p.m., but when I drifted awake later, I realized instantly it wasn't morning. It was 2:00 a.m. Just as I began to wonder what had roused me, I caught a strange, muffled scraping sound, followed by a soft, airy thud. Then it happened again, scrape, thump, scrape, thump. Curiosity got the better of me. I climbed out of bed and peered through the window at my front yard. A man was in my driveway, methodically shoveling the snow. Bundled in heavy, dark winter gear, his features were completely obscured. I watched him for a few minutes, paralyzed by a mix of confusion and creeping dread. I tried to tell myself it was a kind, neighborly gesture, but who performs anonymous manual labor for a stranger at 2 a.m? I decided to confront the situation. I threw on a jacket and shoes, heading downstairs to introduce myself and ask what he was doing. But the moment I opened the front door, the driveway was empty. He had vanished, coincidentally, the exact second I left my vantage point at the window. He hadn't even finished the job. Half the driveway was still buried, with a clean path cut halfway through a section before stopping abruptly. I scanned the street, but the neighborhood was a graveyard of dark windows and silent houses. Strangely, mine was the only driveway that had been touched. The next day followed the same pattern of unpacking and waiting for a knock that never came. More snow fell, layering the street in white. I figured the mystery of the Midnight Shoveler was over. That night, I stayed up a bit later, eventually heading to bed at 11:00 p.m. Again, I woke up just after 2:00 a.m. to that same rhythmic scraping. This time, I didn't hesitate. I sprinted downstairs and burst through the door, but like before, he was gone. No footprints, no retreating figure. The cold air felt heavier as a sense of unease settled into my chest. I waited outside for 15 minutes, but the silence remained unbroken. This cycle repeated for nearly a week. Every night at 2:00 a.m., the sound would return. I eventually stopped trying to catch him, opting instead to lie in bed, disturbed by the persistence of it. I didn't know what to think. Maybe he had a history with the previous owners. I couldn't exactly call the police. Reporting a man for aggressive kindness felt like a joke they wouldn't take seriously. But the way he moved, and the way he always knew exactly when I was coming, felt wrong. On the 6th night, the sound woke me again. Even though I knew what I'd see, I walked toward the window. But just as I reached the glass, the scraping stopped dead. When I looked out, the man was gone. There was less than a second between the sound stopping and my eyes hitting the driveway. He couldn't have cleared the area that fast. Frustrated and on edge, I threw on my boots and yanked open the front door, ready to scour the yard. I nearly fell over in shock. The man was standing on my porch, barely a foot away from the door. He was tall, clutching his shovel at his side. He had a messy, matted beard and long, wet black hair that clung to his face. His eyes were wide and intense, looking terrifyingly sleep-deprived. We stood there in a horrific stalemate. Neither of us moved or spoke for several long seconds. Finally, I managed to choke out a question, asking what he wanted. His expression only tightened, his gaze boring into mine. Without a word, he turned and walked off the porch, heading down the driveway and onto the road until he disappeared into the distance. I locked the door, shaking. I thought about the police again, but what could they do? He was gone, and technically, he hadn't committed a crime. I went back to bed, though I didn't sleep much. The next night, the snow stopped. I spent the day trying to relax, though the isolation of the new town felt more suffocating than before. At 2:00 a.m., I woke up automatically. The silence was absolute, no shoveling, no scraping. I lay there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. When I heard it, a tiny, muffled thump coming from the floor below. It was faint, the kind of sound you'd usually dismiss as the house settling. But given the week I'd had, I couldn't ignore it. I crept downstairs, my eyes locked on the front door, as I reached the bottom of the steps. Then, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. In the middle of the pitch black living room, the man was standing with his back to me. He was perfectly still, clutching that same shovel. I didn't say a word. I turned, ran back upstairs, and locked myself in the bedroom while dialing 911. The police arrived 5 minutes later, finding the back door wide open and the house empty. They filed a report, but with no signs of a struggle or theft, the investigation went nowhere. I'm still not sure what that man's deal was. Friends suggested he might have been sleepwalking, which would explain the robotic, repetitive behavior. But it doesn't explain how he always seemed to know when I was watching him. Regardless, I didn't stick around to find out. I moved away a few months later, still haunted by the memory of that man standing in the dark of my living room. Story 20. The cabin neighbor. Last autumn, I finally fulfilled a long-time dream by moving into a remote cabin in the woods. Between my new remote job and the soaring costs of city living, a tiny, secluded place made perfect sense. I downsized significantly, bringing only the essentials, making the move in process quick and painless. The previous owner, a younger guy selling his parents' estate, assured me the place was well maintained and modernized. From the outside, though, it looked as rugged and isolated as I'd hoped. On my first evening, just as the sun was dipping below the trees, a man knocked on my door. He introduced himself as Chandler, a neighbor from a nearby cabin. He was middle-aged, average-looking, and almost aggressively friendly. After about 15 minutes of small talk, he asked if he could see the inside of the place. I figured since it was mostly empty, and he seemed harmlessly curious, there was no harm in a quick tour. By the time the tour ended, it was dark out. I expected him to head home, but instead, he just sat down on my couch and kept talking. Standing by the door, I eventually had to awkwardly mention that it was late and I needed to turn in. He apologized with a smile, thanked me for the chat, and walked out into the night. I noticed he didn't have a car, so I assumed he was trekking back through the woods on foot. I felt a slight twinge of unease, but I brushed it off as me being overly sensitive to a friendly neighbor. I lit a fire, relaxed on the couch, and eventually drifted off. I woke up about 2 hours later to the sound of the logs crackling. The cabin was silent, but as I went to the kitchen for a glass of water, I heard a faint shuffling right outside the front door. I froze. After a minute of silence, I crept to the door and peeled back the small curtains. Chandler was standing right there on the porch. He jumped when he saw me, then immediately pivoted back into his the top friendly persona, claiming he was just about to knock. It was nearly 9:00 p.m. I knew he'd been standing there longer than he claimed. When I asked what he was doing back, he laughed and invited me to a campfire at his place. I asked where his cabin was, and he pointed down a trail that disappeared into the pitch black forest, claiming it was about a mile away. I declined, telling him I wanted to be alone for a few days. Instead of leaving, he looked past me at my fireplace and suggested, "Why don't we just hang out here then?" My weird feeling turned into genuine fear. I gave him a firm no and closed the curtain. I watched his silhouette linger at the door for a long time before he finally retreated into the woods. My heart was racing. The way he was trying to lure me out into the dark, or force his way back inside, was terrifying. A few minutes later, as I stood in the kitchen trying to calm down, a massive crack echoed through the trees. A gunshot. I ran to the door and looked out. Seconds later, Chandler came sprinting out of the trees, screaming for help. He burst right past me into the cabin, clutching his side and claiming he'd been shot. I looked at him as he hunched over in my hallway, but as his shirt shifted, I saw the silver grip of a revolver tucked into his waistband. Adrenaline took over. I didn't say a word. I grabbed my keys, ran to my car, and floored it. I called the police as I sped toward the station. When officers arrived at the cabin, they found Chandler just sitting in a chair in my living room, as if he were waiting for me to come back. The investigation revealed that Chandler didn't own a cabin. In fact, he didn't have an address at all, and the police couldn't even confirm his real identity. The gun he had was missing exactly one bullet, the one he'd fired into the air to trick me into letting him in. If I had followed him into the woods or stayed in that cabin alone with him, I don't think I would have survived the night. Story 3. The disposal. I'd been living in my new house for about 2 weeks. I'd moved for a new job and settled in quickly. The neighborhood wasn't fancy, just a working class area where people kept their heads down, but it felt safe enough. That changed when I came home one evening to a horrific, rancid smell. I searched the entire house but found nothing, and within a few hours, the odor dissipated. I dismissed it as a fluke until the next day, when the same rotting stench greeted me at the door. This time I did a deep dive, checking every corner of every room. I didn't find the source of the smell, but I found something else. The sliding glass door in the back was unlocked. I am meticulous about locking my doors every night. I hadn't even used that door since moving in. I stepped out into the yard. It was fenced on the sides but backed up into a dense patch of woods. In the dark, it was just a wall of black trees. I went back inside, locked the latch, and spent the night overanalyzing it. Was I losing my mind? Had I left it open by mistake? Nothing was stolen, but the combination of the smell and the door left me deeply unsettled. A few nights later, I was gradually pulled from my sleep by a distant, mechanical buzzing sound, like a machine or a saw. By the time I fully opened my eyes, the sound had stopped. But then I heard something else, a steady, rhythmic dripping. Drip, drip, drip. It sounded like the kitchen faucet. Groggy and annoyed at my own perceived clumsiness, I dragged myself out of bed and headed downstairs. As I got closer to the kitchen, that same rancid, rotten smell hit me with such force it cleared my head instantly. I reached the sink and went to turn off the water, but then I saw it. The sink was filled with something, a torn-up, disfigured mass of flesh. It looked like someone had been trying to jam it down the garbage disposal, but gave up halfway. I looked over at the back door. The latch was flipped up, unlocked. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Someone was in the house with me right now. They had heard me wake up and were hiding. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't want to startle them into an attack. I slowly backed away, retracing my steps toward the stairs. The house was deathly silent. I could hear the blood pumping in my ears. Just as I reached the top of the stairs, heavy footsteps thudded through the kitchen below. I froze. I heard the sound of someone struggling with the sink again, forcing the rest of the material down the drain. Then, the garbage disposal roared to life. After it went quiet, I heard deep, heavy breathing. Then, the sound of a garbage bag being rustled. Finally, the sliding door groaned open, shut, and silence returned. I locked myself in my room and called the police. They found the remains of animal carcasses, likely a deer, that had been meticulously butchered into chunks small enough to fit into the pipes. The smell I'd been noticing was the result of the intruder breaking in multiple times to use my kitchen as a disposal site. The police theorized he thought the house was still empty, but I'd been there for 2 weeks with a full house of furniture. I don't believe that for a second. Whether he was trying to frame me, drive me out, or just found my house to be a convenient place to hide something, I'll never know. Even years later, I still wake up some nights convinced I can smell that rot.